We are ready. We're gonna start now. Let me first. So let me kick it off. Well, good morning to everyone in Singapore. Good evening to our friends in the US, and welcome to the second part of a two-part series that the Middle East Institute has organized with the AJC, which is the American Jewish Committee. As Carl, my colleague, would have told you all last week, this is the first time that we collaborated with the AJC. I hope it isn't the last. I think I want to thank both Mr. Jason Isaacson for taking the time late at night to come and speak to us, but also I would like to thank Shira Lowenberg. I'm not sure if Shira's online, but to thank her and her team at the AJC for working with us to put this event together. I wish the time difference wasn't so wide, so it'd be a bit more civilized for everybody, but it is what it is, you know. Let me talk a little bit about this morning's session. Last week, we actually talked about the dynamics, the questions about the dynamics behind the landmark signing of the Abraham Accords, who might come next. You know, we looked at Israel and the states of the Middle East, this new détente that seems to have occurred, what this means, will it hold, what does the future lie, say, for the Middle East. A bit hard to predict, you know, there are many unknown factors, but I think last week, a very enlightening session with Mr. Jason Isaacson. And this morning, we will talk about the United States. I think I can't quite call the US the elephant in the room, although it is a massive country. But one doesn't look at the Middle East without asking the question about the US. There have been many comments that the US is withdrawing from the Middle East, that it is scaling back, scaling down, which I don't really agree with. I don't think that US foreign policy, regardless of whether it's a Trump administration or a Biden administration, will completely withdraw from the Middle East. You don't see their assets being moved. I think those will stay. There are obviously clear strategic reasons for why the US will want to stay engaged in the Middle East. And it is not really necessarily about oil. You know, you have to look at the geographical location of the Middle East. You need to look at the dynamic of that region. And you have to ask yourself, you know, are there key existential questions that are tied into how the US views the Middle East? But let me stop here and hand over to Mr. Jason Isaacson. And I will just say this again, although I'm sure those of you who came last week know him quite well. He is the Chief Policy and Political Affairs Officer of the Global Jewish Advocacy. He has played a central role in shaping the organization's diplomatic and political profile since he assumed the position of Director of Government and International Affairs in Washington, D.C. in 1991. Prior to that, he had served in senior staff positions in the US Senate and House of Representatives, and also spent a decade as a journalist. For more than a quarter of a century, he has maintained close contact with officials and civil society leaders across the Middle East and North Africa. I think all this background tells you that we speak to someone who is in probably one of the best positions to actually enlighten us on some of perhaps the less obvious aspects of the impact of the US elections on US foreign policy in the Middle East. Mr. Isaacson, I hand over to you.
Michelle, thank you very much. You flatter me. I'm really grateful for that very warm reception, and also want to welcome to this call my AJC colleagues, Shira Lowenberg, whom you identified, and also Dylan Edelman, who are on the line as well. And I'm looking to see if there's anyone else I don't see on this screen in front of me. But AJC is proud to partner with the Middle East Institute in this series of programs, and no, it will not be the end of our collaboration. I'm hoping it's just the very beginning of our collaboration. So look forward to more programs in which your professors and students can participate in programming with AJC, and our staff and lay leaders in our organization can take part in some of your programs as well. And then I hope in the not too distant future actually be together in person. So last week I spoke with you about the Abraham Accords and the lead up to that, and where we go from here, the signing of agreements between Israel and Bahrain, Israel and the United Arab Emirates, and what other countries might be in line, and how the Trump administration helped to sort of engineer this process, its own inherent intrinsic momentum, assisted by the Trump administration as well. This is a subject in which I've spent a great deal of time and flown a great many miles to kind of lead up to that point. I'm very pleased with the role that AJC played as a kind of a contributing factor in helping to prepare the ground for the trust that was necessary, the risks that people were willing to take, the confidence that they had that they could actually proceed with the momentum that was the courage, excuse me, that was necessary in order to break out of old ways of thinking and establish relations between Israel and Arab states in the absence of progress on the Israeli-Palestinian front, which of course had been the structure that everyone had assumed would have to be in place before there could be peace between Israel and other Arab states after Jordan and Egypt. That's a subject on which I've spent, as I said, many years working on. The subject that I'm addressing this morning has always been kind of a background in my work in AJC, and every 4 years, of course, we have a presidential election, and I and my colleagues in the Washington office of AJC become instant experts in the policy positions of the two parties, of the two candidates for president. Clearly, between presidential elections, we're in touch with members of Congress on a range of political issues. But stopping and pausing right now, just 4 weeks. Actually, for you, it's 4 weeks minus a day. For me, it's still 4 weeks from the presidential election that will be so decisive in the United States. This kind of stopping and pausing and examining how the outcome of an election will influence Middle East policy is something that I haven't spent 25 years doing. It's something that I do every 4 years. So I don't think that I'll be able to give you the same intensive, richly textured 50-minute lecture that I surprised myself in giving last week. I think it'll be a little shorter. I'm really looking forward to the question and answer period that will follow my opening remarks. But let me back up before talking about how I expect a Trump administration will handle Middle East issues, Trump administration will handle Middle East issues versus how a Biden presidency would handle Middle East issues. To just talk generally about kind of American presidents' regard for the Middle East, involvement in the Middle East over the last, let's say, 30 years that I've been involved in my position at HAC. And I came to HAC in July of 1991, which was just a few months, 5 months after the end of the first Gulf War. Of course, the collapse of the Soviet Union was in the not very distant background. It was a period of maximum American visibility and least. And of course, in the first Gulf War, President George H.W. Bush had assembled a coalition of 35 countries led by the United States with UN support to push Iraq out of Kuwait. And had developed in the course of that, in the course of assembling this coalition and working very carefully and closely with Arab partners, developed a very close relationship, even closer than the relationships that had existed, which were primarily economic relationships, obviously with a strategic component, but not with the same degree of military cooperation that had to exist in order to make the first Gulf War a success. There was a great deal of delicacy involved in how to bring Israel into this mix. Israel was not a member of the coalition. It would have upset the Arab allies for Israel to be an active participant. But Israel's decision, in consultation with the United States, to be helpful by not joining the coalition was also considered something of value to the Arab states. Israel was attacked directly by Iraq, of course, in the course of all of this, chose not to respond in a way that would upset the plans of the coalition. Fast forward to July of 1991, I joined AJC. October of 1991 was the Madrid Peace Conference that I spoke about last week, as really the opening act in this new phase of peacemaking in the Middle East. So the United States played a very strong role, of course, in convening these partners, these parties from the Arab world, as well as Israel, as well as the Palestine Liberation Organization. It was an exercise which was engineered by Secretary of State Jim Baker, with strong support of President George H.W. Bush. That conference in Madrid in October of 1991 was followed by the multilateral phase of the peace conference in Moscow of 1992. So we now had the United States and now Russia as partners in moving this process forward. The United States very heavily engaged in the Middle East, very focused on the Middle East. President George H.W. Bush did not win re-election in November of 1992, just 10 months or so after the opening of that conference in Moscow. He was succeeded by Bill Clinton. And under Bill Clinton, although it wasn't an American initiative, you had the Oslo Accords signed in Washington, but obviously initiated by the Israelis and Palestinians together by Israeli professors and Palestinian interlocutors, and then the Israeli government playing an ever more active role as that moved forward. You had the Jordan peace agreement. You had Oslo II in 1995. You had an attempt in the last year of President Clinton's tenure, his second administration, to bring the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to some kind of a conclusion at Camp David, negotiations that failed. And then you had the outbreak of the Second Intifada in the fall of 2000, the last months of the Clinton administration. But again, an administration that was focused on the Middle East, had developed a set of relationships, was there for the good times in the 90s, good times that were interrupted, of course, by terror attacks as well, but some good years in the mid to late 90s. And the administration was in close partnership with Israel, as well as with some states that were starting to feel around the edges of a relationship with Israel. So you had, of course, in that period, Qatar and Oman and Morocco and Tunisia establishing low-level relations with Israel from the mid-90s until the outbreak of the Second Intifada in the fall of 2000. Bill Clinton left office in January of 2001. He was succeeded by George W. Bush, the son of George H.W. Bush. And of course, it was in the fall of 2001, September 11th, that the world changed. And you had a very different kind of a focus on the Middle East. You had preparations for war. You had first, of course, the war in Afghanistan, which launched not very long after 9/11, to try to root Al Qaeda out of Afghanistan. And then you had within a year and a half the build up to the second Gulf War. And so you had, for much of the George W. Bush administration, a continuing involvement in the Middle East and a focus on the Middle East, but a very different kind of involvement, a very different kind of focus than what you had in the years after the first Gulf War and through the Clinton administration. But an attempt at Israeli-Palestinian peacemaking, again, toward the end of the George W. Bush administration, the Y conference that was very ambitious, didn't produce a result. You had a close relationship between the United States and the State of Israel, but also some criticism of Israeli settlement policy, very carefully balanced approach that the George W. Bush administration took. But the United States was mired in the Iraq War through so much of the George W. Bush administration. And then you had Obama. Obama comes in. His first foreign trip is to Canada, but within a few months, he's in Turkey. And then in the late spring, early summer of his first year in office, he goes to Cairo and he delivers a major speech. Very unusual for a president to deliver in the first 6 months in office, a speech in an Arab capital. And he he promised a very different approach to the Arab world than had existed under his predecessor. Under George W. Bush, of course, there was a great deal of antagonism stirred up toward the United States, a great deal of mistrust. So many lives were lost in Iraq. So many civilians died in the course of toppling the government, and the mess that was made in the course of that, disbanding the army, and you know the whole story. Obama had a different idea. He wanted to have America be seen in a different way through Arab eyes. And he promised progress on the Israeli-Palestinian front, respecting Palestinian rights, working obviously closely with Israel, but taking a different approach than had existed before, which was of concern to some Israelis, was received with great satisfaction by some in the Arab world. But then, of course, you had in the course of the Obama administration in 2000, the end of 2010 and early 2011. So in the last year and a half of the first Obama administration, the first term, the outbreak of the Arab Spring. And in the course of the outbreak of the Arab Spring, you had a vision that was telegraphed across the Arab world, across the monarchies of the Arab world and the autocracies of the Arab world. And you know, if you count those against the democracies, it's a pretty unbalanced equation. So it really is virtually every Arab state saw the image of the President of the United States as they saw it, throwing the leader of the most important Arab state, the leader of the Arab world, historically, maybe not in actual fact currently, under the bus. When Hosni Mubarak was besieged by his people in Tahrir Square, the American president, instead of standing by his longtime friend and ally Hosni Mubarak, went with the crowd and saw that the pages of history had turned, and Mubarak, it was time for him to go, and ushering him out and making it seem as though the United States was pushing him out, and there was some dispute about that. Nevertheless, earned great discredit to the United States in the eyes of many in the Arab world, certainly Arab leaders. Excuse me, I don't doubt that there were people in the public in the Arab world who welcomed this fresh approach by the United States. Excuse me, but leadership across the Arab world, certainly in the Gulf, certainly in Egypt in the years following, saw in this great danger and a lack of consistency and friendship and in fact, of course, what I was hearing frequently in the years subsequent to that, when I'd be visiting Arab capitals, that the assumption was that Obama was in favor of the Muslim Brotherhood, wanted the Muslim Brotherhood to come in and rule in Egypt, and therefore was happy to discard Hosni Mubarak. And this left a terrible stain on the American reputation in many capitals in the Arab world. And then you had, in the course of the Obama administration, of course, the Arab Spring proceeded in various ways throughout the course of 2011 on into 2012. Obviously, we're still seeing the dissolution of Syria endlessly for the last 8 years. There was an attempt, of course, in the Obama administration to focus on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict under Secretary of State John Kerry. It was a good effort, lasted 10 months, resulted in a freeze on certain kinds of settlement activity by the Israelis, a complete disregard for the possibilities of progress by the Palestinian leadership, which really never engaged fully in any serious way. Much to the disappointment of American diplomats who really earnestly wanted to see if they could push this forward. So you had disregard for the United States in many Arab capitals. You had an attempt to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which went nowhere. And then you had the last chapter of the Obama administration in the end of his second term, a famous Security Council resolution that the United States did not, as it typically would, veto, a resolution that was critical of Israel, critical of settlement policy, and therefore, the end of the Obama administration, you had a president who was despised by many in the Arab world and also despised by the Israeli leadership. Had tried to make certain progress, broke a lot of eggs, didn't make any breakfast out of any of it. And then President Trump comes in, and in the months before he takes office, he is already meeting with Israelis and Palestinians, and his staff are as well, his son and others, his son-in-law and others. And from the very beginning, it was clear that in the Trump administration, you would have a different approach to Israel and the Palestinians. You would have a different approach to the Arab world. So that the first foreign trip that President Trump made, of course, was to Saudi Arabia. It was a complicated trip. He was in Saudi Arabia. Second stop was Israel, and the West Bank, and the Vatican, Rome, I think Brussels. I'm leaving something out. I think it was maybe ending in Brussels. But the image, the message that came from President Trump was that Israel was America's ally and friend, and the United States would do whatever it could to help Israel and to basically achieve whatever objectives the government of Israel wanted. And if the government of Israel thought that it was in its interest to build more settlements in the West Bank, there might be occasional very mild criticism expressed in certain quarters of the State Department, but from the president, not much. He did at one point say early on, I remember a press conference where he was standing in the White House with Prime Minister Netanyahu by his side, and he gave some kind of vague signal about, of course, you know that you're going to have to make certain compromises too, Bibi, that kind of message. But in point of fact, it was pretty much a green light for the Netanyahu government to proceed as his coalition thought it was necessary to proceed to assure the rights of Israelis or Israeli Jews who were living in the West Bank and wanted to expand their families, expand their homes, have other people move into the neighborhood. Very critical of Palestinian leadership. So you had a president who had met early on with the Palestinian leadership and had promised that he would try to make some progress, and he understood the Palestinians and would want to help them secure a better life. But after an initial few months, it was very clear that this administration was going to take a different approach, was not going to follow the usual pattern of predecessors who had insisted on this Palestinian-Israeli conflict first, then maybe in keeping with the Arab Peace Initiative and the standard way of thinking that had prevailed for decades, that then there could be wider Arab-Israeli peace. And that the path to Israeli-Palestinian peace wasn't kind of even-handedness, which had been the mantra for years, even though it was never completely even-handed, even though it was very clear that America's heart was with its democratic ally Israel, and that the corrupt Palestinian leadership, as everyone knew, was not exactly our cup of tea, but it was necessary to work with it, of course, and we'd find a way to do that and try to be as honest a broker as one could. But the Trump administration dispensed with those illusions, and it was very clear from very early on that it wanted to work with Israel. If the Palestinians would play ball, they'd be welcome to join the game. If not, too bad. So you had, of course, the early on in the Trump administration, the announcement of and then the actual move of the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, which did not cause the uproar across the Arab world that some had been predicting. You had the defunding of UNRWA, UN Relief and Works Agency, which had provided aid for Palestinian refugees and descendants of refugees. That's a whole other subject, whether it really is necessary to characterize the grandchildren of refugees as refugees if they're living in houses outside of Amman, but that's another topic. But the administration is sending every possible signal to the Palestinians that life was going to get harder for them if they didn't come back to the bargaining table on the terms that the United States would help set in coordination with Israel. Losing my train of thought here. It's late, excuse me. So you had, as this was going on, as pressure was being put on the Palestinians, you had a plan that was being baked in the White House by Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law and senior advisor, to come up with a different approach that would be outside of the framework of the usual Israeli-Palestinian negotiations, that would have an economic component and a political component. And that was the plan that was unveiled first in its economic aspect in June of 2019 in Bahrain, and then of course the political aspect that was unveiled on January 28th at the White House. But even that plan was really worked out, really almost solely in cooperation with the Israeli government. Palestinians having walked away from any contact with the United States after the announcement by the Trump administration of its plans to move the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. The Palestinians figured at that point there was nothing they could talk about with the United States, and so why even bother? Terrible mistake. The administration was on its own. And then peace to prosperity in Bahrain, the announcement in January of the vision for peace that would allow every Israeli living in the West Bank to stay in his or her home, even those who were in small hilltop settlements deeply embedded in what was typically regarded as Palestinian territory, Area C. A plan that was rejected instantly, of course, by the Palestinians and objected to by many in the Arab world, but not so vigorously objected to by Arab leaders. And the reason for all of this, the reason that the 3 Arab ambassadors attended the introduction of this, the rollout of this plan in January of this year, sitting in the East Room of the White House, 2 rows in front of me, the Bahraini, Omani, and Emirati ambassadors to Washington. The reason that 50 some odd heads of Muslim majority governments, including basically the entire Arab, almost the entire Arab League membership, were in Riyadh when the president visited there in his first year in office. The reason that you had a general warm regard for President Trump had very little to do with Israel. In fact, had nothing to do with Israel. It had to do with the credit that President Trump had earned in the Arab world by his complete 180 from where Obama had left the reputation of the United States, especially in the Gulf, but not just in the Gulf, among Arab monarchs and autocrats. That the United States would not be issuing press releases criticizing your human rights records. It would not be dealing with the Iranian regime that threatens you. It would be fighting the same enemies that you regard as enemies, and that means regional enemies and also maybe even domestic enemies. The United States was really on the side of Arab autocrats and monarchs, not critical of them, and also was looking to do as much business with them as possible. You'll remember, of course, how President Trump was so delightedly bragging about the weapons sales that he was planning to Saudi Arabia in the course of his visit to Riyadh, and then in the months after, including for days or weeks after the murder of Jamal Khashoggi in Istanbul, which was just 2 years ago last week. when President Trump basically was saying that he wasn't going to allow something like this, which he never really labeled murder, to get in the way of hundreds of billions of dollars of arms sales to the Saudis. Why would he do that? All the jobs that would create in the United States. So a very different attitude toward the United States was exhibited by these Arab leaders. So you had a president who at once earned the friendship of the government of Israel and the loyalty of Arab leaders. Certainly those in the Gulf who feel most threatened by Iran. We're most grateful for the United States pullout in 2018 from the Iran nuclear deal. The maximum pressure campaign, every possible effort to push back against Iran. Even if in pulling out of the JCPOA, one could say, okay, the United States applied pressure on Iran, but Iran is still making trouble across the region, is still providing weapons to the Houthis in Yemen and assisting the murderous Assad regime and keeping Lebanon destabilized. Nevertheless, the United States was on the side of these Arab rulers, and that is the climate in which the Abraham Accords was possible. That's the climate in which Israel could reach out to the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, or they could reach out to Israel with the assistance of the United States, knowing that the U.S. was fully on their side, that they had a common enemy, they could do business together. Palestinians had made themselves irrelevant with their corruption and their whining and their lack of practical recognition of their own limitations and failure to seize opportunities that had been given to them multiple times. And so that positive climate is really what's characterized the last year or so. And Trump administration deserves credit for that, without question. Now, going forward, and sort of coming back to the original title, I think, of this talk, which had to do with U.S. elections and Middle East policy, that sort of sets the frame for where the United States has been for the last 30 years, up and down with Arab states, mostly up with Israel, but sometimes with criticism mixed in as well. But I would say bipartisan criticism, which has been almost completely absent in the Trump administration, but existed to one degree or another. At the same time, a close alliance, and I should point out that, of course, under President Obama in his last year in office, there was a huge memorandum of understanding, $38 billion MOU between the United States and Israel for military assistance over the course of 10 years. Very significant. It's been elaborated on a little further on Capitol Hill. Trump administration has carried it forward as well, but I don't want to neglect that aspect of the Obama record toward Israel. So positive on intelligence, positive on military sales and assistance going forward. Criticism on politics, and regarded as having pressure on Israel for how it would deal with the Palestinians, as well as disregarding the warnings of Prime Minister Netanyahu on the nuclear deal with Iran, which the Prime Minister regarded as a naive move on the part of the United States, even as certain people in the military establishment in Israel thought that it probably was the best deal that the United States could achieve. Now that sets the stage for where we are today. So it's 2020. You have the United States for the last 2+ years out of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action and exerting maximum pressure on Iran. You have an administration that will work with Israel to widen the circle of Arab-Israeli peace. An administration that is not expecting much in the way of progress of the Palestinians unless the Palestinians are willing to speak honestly with their people about the more limited state that is in their future, rather than this kind of maximalist, unrealistic dream of what might have been, but is no longer really possible in any kind of practical way, given the hundreds of thousands of Jews who are living in the West Bank. Some adjustments can be made, certain swaps can be done, but it's not going to be what Yasser Arafat promised and what Mahmoud Abbas has refused to unpromise in the years that he's been leading the Palestinians for the last 15 or so years. A Joe Biden administration would take, I think, a different approach in certain respects. There would be some consistency, I think, in American policy, beginning with Iran. And I'll tell you that that the American Jewish Committee has been discussing with Biden advisors and with others in the Democratic foreign policy establishment the issue of Iran and how to move forward after an administration, if he were to take office, in light of where we are today with Iran. That the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, negotiated in 2014 into 15, agreed to in mid-2015. Conditions are different 5 years later. Iran, having gained certain assets that had been frozen, but for its own internal reasons, because I'm not sure how many of those assets actually went into the wars in Syria or Yemen or elsewhere, didn't move in the direction that people were hoping. That the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, it was hoped, would of course reduce to a very tiny quantity the stockpile of enriched uranium, would disable the plutonium reactor, would pathway rather to a bomb, would restrain the development of advanced centrifuges, would provide for greater inspections, all these aspects of removing the immediate nuclear threat, lengthening the breakout time for Iran. That all of that had that was put in place in 2015. By 2020, what we are seeing is even if the United States had not pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal, the expectation is that Iranian behavior in the region would not necessarily have changed so much. It certainly didn't change before May of 2018 when the U.S. pulled out of the nuclear deal. It was heavily involved in Syria. It was heavily involved in Yemen. It continued to threaten Gulf Sunni Arab states in the Gulf. So the expectation that that somehow 2015 nuclear deal would be transformational in Iran was asking a lot, and it didn't seem to have played out in 2018, and certainly today, with the U.S. having pulled out, with Iran now increasing its stockpile of enriched uranium, putting on more advanced centrifuges, making it more difficult for IAEA inspectors. All of that suggests we can't just go back to 2015 if the United States wanted to under President Biden. He has spoken, and his advisors have spoken about the United States wanting to re-enter the JCPOA on the condition that Iran complies with the agreement as it was signed in 2015. What he has also said, and certainly a point that we have made consistently with advisors to Vice President Biden, is that it's not enough. It's not enough for the United States just to have Iran stop doing its bad things on the nuclear side, continue to do its bad things on the non-nuclear side in the region, in missile development, and also recognizing that the timelines that were sort of in the middle distance in 2015 are no longer in the middle distance in 2020. The end of the restrictions on centrifuge development, et cetera. There has to be something else. It's not good enough just to rejoin the JCPOA. And so what we've heard from Vice President Biden, and what we just heard from Tony Blinken in an interview that he gave a few days ago, as he has said before, including as he has said on an AJC program that we had him on a few weeks ago, that the United States would want to re-enter diplomacy, would want to work closely with our allies, with the E3, Britain, France, and Germany, to not just have the JCPOA, but to build on the JCPOA, to focus on the other issues that were neglected, could not be included in the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. And that means missiles, and it means lengthening significantly the timelines, if not indefinite prevention of Iranian enrichment, at least stretching it out far more than had been the case, doing something on inspections as well, and something about regional activity, and that the United States could actually be in the position to achieve that if it was cooperating with our allies instead of working in opposition to our allies, and that, of course, is the current state of affairs. So under a Biden administration, I would expect some movement toward rejoining JCPOA, but parallel to that, movement toward corralling allies into a very different kind of a framework that would, I would imagine, involve taking the brakes off of certain of the sanctions that have been imposed on Iran. So loosening the sanctions on Iran, conditioned on certain Iranian behavior. But I hope, but I worry, but the hope would be that in short order there could be negotiations toward something stiffer, longer, more secure. But there's an element of concern about this, because if you loosen the restrictions on Iran, and if you make it easier for the Iranians to fund their nefarious activities in the region, you're going to have the same negative consequences in the Gulf. You're going to have the same blood that's being shed across the region thanks to Iranian terror and ambitions. So I'm worried about that. But that's the direction that I can see playing out under President Biden. But I can also see under President Biden, and he has said this himself when he welcomed the Abraham Accords on September 16th, the day after they were signed at the White House, that he would want to build on the momentum achieved in the Trump administration in assisting in the widening of the circle of peace between Israel and Arab states. There are a number of states that are clearly in line for the possibility of normal relations with Israel, normalizing their relations with Israel. Oman would be in that category. Sudan is clearly in that category as well. Once certain issues involving its inclusion in the list of state sponsors of terrorism, and there is some political progress on that front, as well as an economic assistance package that the Sudanese desperately need as they struggle through their transition from the tyranny of Bashir to something more promising in the future. I can see a Biden administration moving forward on those fronts, as well as on the Saudis. The Saudis have indicated a certain acceptance of the momentum that they see in the smaller states alongside Saudi Arabia in the GCC. There have been indications by a number of prominent Saudis that they would like to see themselves moving in the same direction over the coming years. Some of this depends on the willingness of King Salman to kind of break with his more traditional approach to Arab-Israeli peace predicated on Israeli-Palestinian peace. But that's very obviously the direction that Mohammed bin Salman would like to take it. And I can see a President Biden, Freudian slip, moving in that direction as well. Now, what I think you'll also see, if it were President Biden, is a renewed focus, and he's made this very clear, as has Tony Blinken, as have others around in the Biden circle, a more robust focus on human rights, certainly than has existed in the Trump administration, but probably not all that different from what we saw under previous administrations, Obama and George W. Bush as well. After all, it was under George W. Bush that you had this whole idea, one of the sort of theoretical foundations of the invasion of Iraq was that there would be an attempt to introduce democracy in the Arab world. With Iraq, good luck to you. But the idea maybe not of pushing democracy so hard in the Arab world, but at least pushing back against the worst abuses, the worst human rights abuses. So it is entirely foreseeable that you would have an Obama in a Biden administration, a return to a more typical American approach on human rights. And that means friction with Egypt, friction with Saudi Arabia, probably less friction with some of the other Gulf states, but it will change the atmosphere. What it might do, however, is because you would also have certain criticism, or at least maybe a different approach to Israel, continued, of course, close support on the military front, on the intelligence front, but a more critical attitude toward Israeli intransigence, as a Biden administration might see it, on peacemaking with the Palestinians. So you might have, again, an administration that was critical in certain respects toward Israel, but also critical in certain respects toward Arab allies. I wonder if that might not produce the same dynamic as American support for Israel and Gulf states. You might have Israel and its newfound friends in the Gulf feeling that they really have to stand together and push back against this new misguided, naive administration in Washington. So I think that could be another interesting possible dynamic that will further expand Arab-Israeli relations. I'm trying to think of other aspects of Middle East policy that would interest this group, but maybe the best thing to do is to stop there. I think, again, just to recap really quickly, I think under a Trump administration, Middle East policy will continue on the same path. I think that although the president said that if he's reelected, within 30 days, the Iranians will be suing for peace with the United States on the nuclear front to restore their crippled economy. I don't think that's going to happen, but you'll have an increasing ratcheting up of pressure. Maybe at some point the Iranians break, if that's even within their capability to do so. You'll have a continued American, I think, close partnership with Gulf Arab states, with President Sisi in Egypt as well, and a very close partnership with Israel. We could talk about other parts of the world as well, China, Russia, North Korea. Obviously, I'd see a continuation of certain American policies, but I know this focuses the Middle East. Whereas with a President Biden, I think you will have a continuation, maybe with a lack of the same kind of obsessive drive of this administration, but a continued push by Washington on wider Arab-Israeli peace, general support for Israel, an insistence on trying to get back to the bargaining table, trying to push forward the two-state solution. That's a formula that wasn't heard so much in the Trump administration. You heard that formulation in the January 28th Vision for Peace, but a very different kind of a two-state solution than what has long been envisioned. It would be a very much Swiss cheese approach to a Palestinian state, may or may not be terribly viable. Could be a basis for something, to begin negotiations, but not viable the way it was presented. But I think you would have a Biden administration that would want to return to a more traditional formula, but recognizing, I very much hope, and of course this will be a subject of much conversation with the Biden team if he does win, a more realistic approach to Iran, and I hope a seizing of opportunities that exist across the region for Israel. That will also strengthen America's reputation and national interests in that vital region. Maybe at that point I will stop. I surprised myself by talking almost as long as I talked last week, and let's have a conversation.
Thank you. I would say that
Thank you.
it's not a surprise for me because you have that depth of knowledge and experience, and your perspective has certainly been very interesting. Before I sort of make a comment or say something, let me just let the audience know that we will open up for questions. I think we would, both Mr. Isaacson and I would prefer that you raise your hand and you actually ask the question directly of Mr. Isaacson, but identify yourself. And try not to use the chat, although I could ask the questions for you, but I think it's of greater value to all of us if you were to actually ask the question directly. Yeah. Thank you for that. That was actually very interesting. One, I think, having traced the last 30 years and gone through various administrations from the first George Bush through to the Clinton administration, and then George W. Bush, and then to Trump, and what it might be like if it were to be a Biden administration. I think for me, in tracing that sort of history and telling that story, it's very clear that all this speculation that the US is going to withdraw from the Middle East is nonsense. They're not, okay? Yeah. They have interest there. Now, while oil may no longer be the driving factor, because the US is now a net exporter, it doesn't mean that there aren't other viable economic and business interests between the Middle East countries and the United States. The second is that there is a strategic imperative for the US to stay where it does. And you will see that its fleet remains quite entrenched, because the Persian Gulf is an important, there are important sea lanes that go through the Persian Gulf. And there's also, and you can't neglect that. It is not something that the US would do solely for the Middle East. You can see that they maintain these interests globally, and I think that is something that we always forget about. We've been so used to seeing American boots on the ground that we forget how long the US has actually been mired in various wars in the Middle East. And I'm quite sure the American public is asking, why are we doing this? So in my view, whatever it is about the Trump administration, he articulates probably what the common man feels, and you do get to a point where you get very tired of this, I think a Biden administration, I was thinking about this actually last night while I was preparing for today's session. What would a Biden administration be like? I do agree with you. I think they would be much more traditional, but I also don't think they can completely sweep away everything that the Trump administration has done, because the world has changed. The region has changed. Yeah. It is the complexities of 5 years ago or 10 years ago have changed. The priorities, the parameters, everything has changed. And I think what we need to understand is that you can't look at what the Obama administration did, and if you come in as the Biden administration, then revert back to what the Obama administration did. You can't. Many things have changed since then. It is a question of looking at what the Trump administration has done and where can you build on some of this. Doesn't say what he needs to say in the most elegant terms, but there is a strategy, and it is not entirely out of whack with the general thrust of US foreign policy. So I think that's something that I wanted to say. Now, we've got two people who have raised their hands. They are both my colleagues. The first person is Dr. Tilak Doshi, and after that, it will be Dr. Alessandro Ardino. So Tilak, you have the floor. Please ask your question of Mr. Isaacson.
Yes, thank you again very much for an excellent summary, as good as the one that you gave the previous time. My question, by the way, I'm Tilak Doshi, as the visiting senior fellow at the Middle East Institute.
I have introduced you already, Tilak.
Okay. Right.
It's Tilak, thank you.
Thank you, Jason. My question relates to the Biden's election platform that he's made apparent over the months of electioneering. In particular, his approach to oil and gas. He's made conflicting statements on fracking and on federal lands, as well as the general approach to oil and gas. He's signing on to the Green New Deal. His appointment of AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, as committee chair, co-chairperson of his panel on climate change. Now, if we believe that Biden is increasingly being brought to the left on issues on energy, among the things that energy watchers are concerned about is On the one hand, a reduction of US oil and gas production. If they weaponize EPA the way the previous administration did against fracking and so on. Now, if that were the case, we would have the first impact being a reduction of the role of the US in increasing oil production, oil and gas production, which would mean higher oil prices, which would mean the Middle East getting a silver lining out of this black cloud. On the other hand, rapprochement with both Venezuela and Iran would mean unleashing of more oil. Now, in this general sort of parameters of great uncertainty, where do you see yourself standing with respect to energy policy in a Biden administration? Thank you.
Well, really interesting, Tilak. Thank you. And you're obviously more expert on these issues than I am. Just a couple of thoughts. I think Biden has kind of been on both sides of the Green New Deal. Well, not actually on both sides, but he sometimes says he's not in favor of the Green New Deal. He has his own, Biden approach toward reducing greenhouse gas emissions, getting off, power plant, making the power plant sector green by 35, I think, but then no net carbon emissions by 50. I think that's his benchmark, which isn't exactly the Green New Deal, but it's obviously moving in that direction, certainly from where we are now, and certainly anything that could be envisioned under a Trump administration. He's also been a little bit fuzzy on fracking. I mean, he has, I would expect, yes, as you say, although I don't know if I would say it as a war on energy, but or the EPA war on energy or whatever. I'm trying to remember your exact phrase, but clearly a return to some of the EPA regulations on methane emissions and that sort of thing, which are really startling and has, I think, broad, even bipartisan concern if people were not so afraid of crossing Donald Trump. But it's been the traditional, even pretty conservative Republican position on certain environmental regulations, which Trump has just totally shredded. So I would think that there would be not a ban on fracking, but an insistence on certain environmental controls. So yes, would that reduce the incentives for fracking, which are already difficult because of the low price of oil? Yeah, it might. You're right. It might change that, and it might therefore lead, after X number of months, to higher oil prices. At the same time, as someone who hopes to at some point have grandchildren and great-grandchildren, I welcome the idea that we'll have perhaps an administration that will push back against more carbon emissions. So we'll have to sort of figure out how this all balances out. I don't know that. Well, I think you're reminding me that I need to spend a little more time focusing on the energy plank of a Biden administration. I would expect it to be, I would hope, more pragmatic than the sort of dark vision that you laid out as a possibility. But it clearly will be different from a Trump administration, a continuation of a Trump administration, which is taking all the brakes off of production, including every possible pipeline to every possible coal tar sand deposit anywhere in North America, and drilling in various continental shelves, including in the Arctic, in ways that I think pose real threats to the environment, to fisheries, to the air we all breathe. So I'm hoping for something that's practical, that's pragmatic, but certainly more restrictive than what currently exists. Now, if that means putting more money into the pockets of the Saudis, I think it's a possibility. But I also know that with the pandemic and the recession, these equations are also fuzzy now anyway. It may be a few years before we're even able to think about that. As far as changing the dynamic with Venezuela and Iran, I don't know. I mean, my guess is that a Biden administration would be under enormous pressure, bipartisan pressure, to not go so easy so easy on Iran. I can foresee an easing of certain sanctions, but not so much that it would suddenly liberate the Iranian economy. As far as Venezuela goes, I mean, there's universal condemnation of the oppressive regime and anti-democratic regime in Venezuela. I don't see, unless there's a breakthrough or Maduro just decides to give up, I don't see that correcting itself anytime soon, and therefore relief of U.S. sanctions on Venezuela.
Thank you. Alex, you have the floor.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Just a quick question. You mentioned that in case Biden wins, one of the trends in the Middle East could be corralling allies. In case Trump is going to the second term, is a continuing policy. What this means for Yemen, especially if we look at Yemen as a launchpad for drone attacks like the one on Aramco. Thank you.
Interesting question. Thank you, Alex. Look, you saw bipartisan censure of the administration's efforts to assist the Saudis and the Emiratis when they were active in the air campaign in Yemen. There is a general sense that the battles in Yemen have been a humanitarian disaster, and that an administration, if a Biden administration were to come in and to have any kind of a human rights agenda at all, I cannot see them being complicit in the least with the Saudi campaign, assuming that it continues. It's not clear that the Saudis want very much to continue their activities in Yemen. There has to be a way of de-escalating. The Emiratis have already pulled back a significant part of their own commitment to the fight in Yemen. If the Saudis can be, because of their own logic or certain pressure from a different administration, it might change the situation significantly, I think. But Yemen will continue to be a basket case. I mean, I remember visiting Yemen decades ago when it was a different kind of basket case. But in the last 20 years, with Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and every other possible terrorist group, and the Iranian involvement as well, I don't know how we're going to fix all of the damage that's been done by Yemenis and by outsiders to that country, but it should be high on the world's list of priorities for repair of the damages of the recent years.
Does it answer your question, Alex?
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay. You know, I was thinking about what you had said about the foreign policy, and we looked at some of the sort of more obvious sort of aspects that you know, what Trump would continue to look at, and sorry, I'm just slightly distracted here. What the Trump administration would continue with, and what some adjustments might occur if there was a Biden administration. But I also thought I wanted to switch gears a little bit and return to something that Carl just reminded me about online when we talked with you last week. You know, Prince Bandar gave a very sort of revealing interview recently in which he essentially called Palestinian leaders losers. Let me be very politically incorrect here. And
this is the Al Arabiya
yes. So our question,
I was just watching it. I was watching it earlier today.
So our question is this, you know, do you think he's telegraphing something? Because he clearly could not have said this without either the king's assent or that of MBS, right?
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I think he is. And we've had other, you know, signals either from MBS in person, but privately, although less privately in an interview with Jeffrey Goldberg in The Atlantic, which I think I mentioned last week. but yes, I think Prince Bandar's comments were revealing. But you know, anyone, any diplomat, or even someone like myself who has spent time traveling in the Arab world and sitting with foreign ministers or heads of state and talking about the region and having a very frank discussion without cameras or tape recorders, we'll hear again and again just enormous frustration with Palestinian leadership. But to hear Prince Bandar speak so openly on Arabiya of the various times that Palestinians have been given opportunities and have gone the wrong way. I mean, he basically said that you know, every important decision that they had to make, they made the wrong decision. It was really startling. He said some things about Israel that were incorrect as well, and had sort of mischaracterized some of what happened in 1948. But from a Saudi perspective, and I can understand it's a different perspective than mine, from mine. But what he had to say about the Palestinians, I hope, is read in Ramallah as, you know, a friend of the Palestinian people, representing a country that has certainly, although not so consistently in recent years, but over time, been there for the Palestinians again and again, fought wars, not always, by the way. He made it seem as though Saudi Arabia was active in every war against Israel. It's not exactly true. There were five Arab armies that were arrayed against Israel in the War of Independence, 48-49. And the Saudis had some soldiers, some volunteers, but they were not one of the Arab armies. But nevertheless, give him, you know, his due. There has been Saudi support for the Palestinian cause in general. But to hear him say that, you know, that has all been repaid with by the Palestinians just ignoring the advice and making the wrong decision again and again, including, by the way, sticking their knives into the back of so much of the region by supporting Saddam Hussein when he invaded Kuwait, which obviously was chilling to the Saudis and to others in the region. That was fascinating. So yes, is that somehow preparing the Saudi public for a different attitude toward Israel? Possibly. It's also sending a signal to the Palestinians that they should get off their high horse and stop rejecting the Emirati-Israeli agreement and the Bahraini-Israeli agreement, see that the wind is changing, and they've got to come up with a different strategy if they want to resolve their longstanding conflict with Israel.
But didn't he also say that the Palestinians sided with Hitler?
He pointed that out quite directly, and Arabiya, you know, provided the pictures as well of the imam in Jerusalem doing a Heil Hitler salute as he met with the Führer. So yes, you're absolutely right.
Well, as you know,
by the way, it's Prince Bandar speaking, and it's also Arabiya, which of course is Saudi owned, although it's based in the UAE, contributing to that message as well.
True. Those are things to think about. I mean, I have to say that as an ex-diplomat, I was rather taken aback by the interview. And you know, Carl has a journalist background. He spotted the article. And honestly,
you're so right.
When he sent it to us, I mean, it woke me out early in the morning, you know, because I was like, good Lord, people don't say these things in public unless, you know. So it was interesting.
Yeah. Good.
Let me just ask you another question. He didn't just talk about the Palestinian issue. He spoke about the GCC crisis, and he called the Qataris ticks. Is there nothing that can solve this crisis? I mean, you know.
That was something. Ticks and camels. Yes. You know, I've asked about this, and you know, it wasn't so many years ago that I was in Qatar from time to time. I guess the last time I was there was maybe 3 years ago now. I have seen zero willingness on the part of any of these parties to yield and compromise. They seem to be quite prepared to maintain the status quo. The Qataris, under the previous emir, seem to be not ideological so much as opportunistic. Obviously, very concerned with maintaining their wealth and their security, and to maintain their wealth and their security. They felt that they had to deal with pretty much everybody. And so they seem to have, one could say, a moral-free foreign policy. But from their point of view, it was practical for a tiny country that was enormously rich and was very small. I mean, very small population, and surrounded by people who didn't necessarily have their best interest at heart. But under the present Emir, it's not so clear that they're just simply opportunistic. I think they may also be ideological. And so you have this bizarre alliance between Qatar and Turkey, which I think flows obviously to some degree from Turkey's desire under Erdogan to extend the reach of his rule, but also a relationship with Iran that is not just the old kind of functional relationship that Qatar had with Iran because they happen to share a huge gas field under the Gulf, but was something more than that. And obviously some of this is driven by the fact that the Qataris are isolated in the region. If they want to fly out of there, they have to fly over Iranian airspace. I understand all that, but you have this bizarre Qatar, Iran, Turkey axis in a way that I don't know how you break. And unless the Saudis and the Emiratis and Bahrain and Egypt are willing to go back on their very firm commitment to not yielding on Jazeera, not yielding on certain other meddling that they see the Qataris engaged in, I don't know how we end this. In the meantime, I was talking to someone in a think tank in Bahrain just I guess it's now yesterday for me, 2 days ago for you, who was saying, you know, the Bahrain, small country, in the early days of the crisis with Qatar, there were some personal relationships that were interrupted by not being able to travel between the countries because there are families that have, you know, in-laws or something in Qatar. A limited amount of sort of business disruption because of the break with Qatar, but that was, you know, in the first months, and now it's really, you know, we're fine. We can go on like this for a long time. I think the Emiratis feel the same way. I don't think the Saudis are particularly upset by it. So we may just be stuck with this fracture for a while. Maybe a U.S. administration applying a different kind of approach, a different kind of pressure, which the Trump administration tried a little bit, but hasn't really succeeded, maybe would be more successful. You know, we'll see.
Thank you. Okay, I don't want to hold you for too long. We have one last question from my colleague Asif Suja, who is a senior research fellow at the Institute. And then I will close off with a question where I'm going to put you out on a limb with that question. But let's take the question from Asif first. Asif, you have the floor.
Thank you, Michelle. My question to our guest is related to the success that, foreign policy success that Trump administration has shown in terms of Abraham Accord, which is a great, epoch of history for Israel. I just wanted to know that in Israelis' calculation, how much, because the Arab countries are falling in line in terms of recognition of Israel. Now, it is Iran which is left, major countries. And since our guest Isaacson is known to break barriers, and I just wanted to know, I think he's the right person to tell us if there is some talk, some negotiation, some rippling of waters is going on on the front of Iran's, recognition of Israel. This last barrier that is there in the full statehood full recognition of Israel from the international community. Is there something going on? If you could tell us, even in the broadest hint, way. Thank you.
Asif, I had a little trouble understanding my computer audio isn't so great. Are you saying the possibility of negotiations between Iran and Israel?
Yes.
That's fascinating. I think the short answer is no. So that can end our conversation. But at the same time, it's in the muscle memory of many Israelis and Iranians of a certain age that there was a relationship, of course, between Iran and Israel that was quite close, you know, up until the Iranian Revolution of 79. So it's not inconceivable that that there could once again be a relationship. You may also remember the pictures, the really moving video shots that one could see. This was last year. I don't know. Everything before the pandemic seems like 10 years ago, but I don't think it was more than a year ago that you had this. I remember seeing this image of students in Tehran who were walking around instead of on top of the painted flags of the United States and Israel on some plaza, I think near a university campus. The intention of the regime had been, you know, trample on the Israeli flag, trample on the American flag, and the people had a different idea. I think there could generally be the basis for a relationship between Iran and Israel if the Iranian regime weren't so hell-bent on using Israel as a target to help kind of mobilize its population and distract it from the problems of the regime has caused itself. But I don't believe that that in the foreseeable future there is the likelihood of any kind of negotiations between Iran and Israel. Again, absent a change in regime.
Thank you. Last question. Who do you think might win the 3rd November elections? We're going to put you out on a limb here. You know, are there more surprises in store? I mean, what we've seen is that the polls are showing that Biden is actually leading. You know, but you know, you can never say never with US elections because it's always unpredictable, always surprises in store. I think that's one. You may not be able to make a prediction. But the other question I would ask is, should the Biden administration win, essentially there would be a period where the Trump administration would be effectively a lame duck administration. Do you think that Trump, given the way he is, I think he would be tempted to, but do you think he would be tempted to try to set the tone for foreign policy, at least in the Middle East, perhaps try to leave some kind of imprint or, you know, leave sort of a certain situation that his successor may not be able to undo? Do you think he might do that?
Really interesting set of questions, Michelle. So first on the question of who I think is likely to win, you're right. I mean, the polls now show Biden ahead, and ahead in certain significant, to a significant degree among certain demographics, way ahead among women, including very different numbers among white women, among college-educated women, very different numbers in the suburbs than existed in the Clinton-Trump race in 2016. In key battleground states that are essential for an electoral college victory, Biden is ahead by either a little bit or significant numbers in some states. So the numbers are very favorable to Biden right now. Trump can still win. First of all, as you know, there's this massive effort to suppress the vote, to make it harder for people in certainly in minority communities to vote in red states, Republican-dominated states, Republican-governed states, closing down polling places in the state of Texas, which has a Republican governor, now limiting the number of collection boxes for ballots, which in three of the cities that are among the largest cities in the country are in Texas, and in these counties, excuse me, not cities, but counties that have significant populations, there is like one drop-off box, purposely for the purpose of making it harder mostly for minorities to vote, Latino voters and African American voters. And there'll be multiple challenges in various courts to mail-in voting. And so there are already thousands of lawyers who are deployed for this purpose, and there'll be intimidation of voters and all kinds of ugliness. So I can expect really the most contentious election in American history seems to be guaranteed at this point, and an outcome that will not be certain necessarily on November 3rd, unless it's a blowout for Biden. And I think a blowout is not likely. I think the numbers will favor Biden, but but there could be a lot of mischief and a lot of cheating and a lot of politically motivated court decisions that would push it the other way. I mean, certainly, Trump deserves credit on these Middle East issues that we discussed. And certainly one could say that the economy until the pandemic was humming along. One could also say that it was humming along not at the same fever pitch under the last years of Obama, who had inherited a terrible economy after the 2008-2009 recession. But Biden has a very different attitude on the pandemic, a very different attitude on science, a very different attitude on the climate, a very different attitude on race relations, on a whole range of things that have earned him support among various constituencies in the United States. If it's a fair election, I expect him to win. If it's not a fair election, it is entirely foreseeable that President Trump would get a second term. That's not something I'd love to be quoted on, but I think that's a fact. You had a second question, and you remind me what it was.
We asked if in terms of his Middle East foreign policy.
Would something happen after the election if he were to lose?
Yeah.
Well, I don't. If Trump loses on November 3rd or the days after November 3rd, I don't expect him to go quietly. So it's a little hard to predict. He's not been easy to predict for the last 4 years.
That's true.
So I don't know what he would be capable of. Do I believe that he would want to leave a positive legacy? I think so. I think that some people with him would want to leave a positive legacy. I think he would also want to make it as difficult as possible for his successor to succeed. And there would be a number of ways that he could try to mess things up and make it difficult. I don't necessarily foresee the starting of wars, but I think that there will be a whole strategy session on November 4th or 5th or 7th or whenever, if there's a final decision, on how they can make it difficult for President Biden to succeed. I think that is foreseeable. So we're in for a rough ride. It's been a very tricky 3.5 years with some ups and downs. I think the months ahead will be difficult. So Singapore, as a longtime friend of the United States, we will want your friendship. We will want you to recognize that the great majority of the American people, want to restore the reputation and the strength and the reliability of the United States. And I think with your support, we'll keep moving in that direction.
Thank you. So let me let you go because it's late for you. You've spoken continually for almost an hour and a half with great patience, and taken the trouble to answer every single question. I want to thank you very, very much for today and for last week. Two very, very interesting sessions. I think we really benefited from your experience and your knowledge. I also want to thank the American Jewish Committee, and I hope that we will continue with this collaboration, and that, yes, sometime in the not too distant future, we will actually be able to all meet in person. So thank you very much. Please all join me in thanking Mr. Jason Isaacson, who has spent 2 evenings with us and, and has given us a lot to think about, and also been, very, very knowledgeable and generous in sharing his views. Thank you very much. We will see you soon.
Thank you, Michelle. It's my great pleasure. Good to be with you. Thank you, and have a good day.
You too.
Bye.
Take care. Bye.